Thank you very much, Kevin. Good Sabbath to everybody. I don't really have much in the way of announcements. I was thinking as we were closing the last hymn there and getting ready for Bill to plug in from Pennsylvania. Wow, it's really nice to be able to plug into Pennsylvania and Colorado and Arizona and California, Ohio, different people that are attending with us electronically, both now and after services during our discussion. So that's really a blessing to have that technology. I do want to start with a bit of a story. There was a young man who had landed a job, and he was hired to paint those double yellow lines you see down the highway. He was hired to paint a double yellow line down an old highway. And there was a couple of conditions, though, and the first was that he had to paint the line by hand, and he had to use paint from cans that were going to be dropped off at mile marker 1, I believe it was. And so after 3 days of painting, the man was called into the office, and the foreman said, "You've been doing a really good job, at least the first few days. The first day of your job, you did very well. You painted 3 miles worth of a yellow line. The second day was not too bad. You painted 2 miles of that yellow line. But the third day, you only painted 1 mile, and for that reason, we're going to need to let you go." As the man sorrowfully walked out of the office, he looked back and he said, "It's not my fault. Every day, the paint cans got further away from where I needed to paint." It's kind of funny, but you see that the point is, even in a humorous situation, small details matter. Let's go over to Luke 16. Small stuff can make a big difference. It was reported in National Geographic that on January 12th of 1997, there were 2 Swiss men, and I don't have their names in my notes, but they set out to be the first people to circle the Earth in a balloon. And you know what I'm talking about. We're talking about the hot air balloons. The vessel that they were going to use to circle the Earth was called a high-tech masterpiece. It was complete with solar panels, and it had an airtight capsule for the men to stay in that was pressurized so that they could survive well at high altitudes. This would enable them to be able to fly the jet stream at around 200 miles per hour as they circled the globe. Now, the cost of this high-tech machine at that time was $1.5 million. Considering that was near 30 years ago, the cost would likely be more than double today. After liftoff, with the cabin sealed, and it was airtight or somewhat airtight, pressurized, so these men could be comfortable and survive the journey, the pilots noticed kerosene fumes coming into the chamber. They emailed their control center saying, and this is a quote, "Kerosene coming through each pipe on both inside tanks, and we cannot tighten them anymore. It is a nightmare. Answer quick." And so they were advised to lower the altitude of the balloon and open up the capsule to let some fresh air in and hold on till they could reach the coast of Algeria. But the fumes were too overwhelming for these individuals, and they were forced to ditch the craft in the Mediterranean. The problem of this flight was a small clamp, much like you might see on that of a radiator hose. I have an example of one right here. This type of a clamp was the problem. The cost of this clamp, $1.16. It was a small thing, but of course we see that this minute detail made a big difference. It undermined, in fact, a great enterprise, and it would be a number of years until somebody was able to actually complete going around the entire globe in a hot air balloon. Now, you and I, we've all had moments where we were frustrated, worried, disappointed perhaps over a small thing. And you've probably heard the expression, "Don't sweat the small stuff." It's used as an encouragement for us to refocus and move our energy to something that is more important, things that are of more significance. Maybe your pet urinated on the carpet, or perhaps you spilled some wine on the couch. That happened at our house one time, and I admit I overreacted to that at the time. Maybe the toilet's backed up. Maybe you got ink on your favorite blouse. It's pretty frustrating at the moment, and this stuff can be concerning, but it's, you can compare it to the phrase of there's no use crying over spilled milk. It helps us to reevaluate our situation and how we're going to react to such things, and then think, I think this is a time when I shouldn't sweat the small stuff. Don't sweat the small stuff. Richard Carlson, he wrote a self-help book in 1997, and the book was used that phrase as the title. And he offered some simple strategies in this book to reduce stress and anxiety in an ever-increasing stressful and anxietous world. And this is a concept, of course, that is worth considering. But we have to proceed with caution. We must use it in context, because a big problem, can arise when we attempt to reduce the stress of something that we might think is subjective, when actually it's objective. For example, I had received an email recently from a person who is not a part of the Church of God. Yeah, but they have requested several of our booklets. They were interested in historical facts and in biblical truth. And so they had read our booklet, The Truth About Christmas, and I had asked them what they thought of the material that was presented. And this is part of the response. He said, "To be honest, I'm not sure how to feel about it. I think the information is good. I certainly enjoy it, but it's painful too. The more sensitive to sin you become, the worse you feel. And though you should be a light, you feel like you are walking further into darkness." This person might think, well, I'm not going to sweat the small stuff. They might want to apply that to this situation, because something like Christmas to many doesn't seem like such a big deal in the bigger scope of what God requires of people. So, another expression, you might say, well, there's bigger fish to fry. The tendency of human nature is to avoid discomfort when it comes to things that we think are unimportant, and even when it comes to some things which actually might be very important, even a matter of salvation. People might think that's small stuff, it's not going to make a difference. God cares about other things. Well, those who are new to church doctrine, clearly they would look at many of the things that you and I do, or many of the things that we will not participate in, and they might think, where does it all end? They would consider us perhaps overly concerned, maybe uptight, even perhaps call us Pharisaical. But even within the Church of God, many have considered many things that are taught in our little group here, the internal Church of God. We have been called Pharisaical more than once. And this is, of course, particularly regarding our observance of the Sabbath, where we don't think it is entirely inappropriate and a violation of the Sabbath to do things like going out to restaurants. But they would apply other things that we teach as well, such as the required offerings only being 3 times a year as opposed to 7. The appropriate way to apply Matthew 18, and pointing out where much of the time in the Church of God it is not applied, that they just skip that instruction for reconciliation. And so, but many people, even in the Church of God, they might look at some of the things that you hear taught in this organization and say, you guys are sweating the small stuff. You need to lighten up. But exactly what is considered small according to God, that's what's important. It's not what we think is small or big, it's what God thinks. And many times we see that what we might think is negligible is actually something that God considers to be very important. And so while we do need to let some things go, there are some things, and I'm not talking doctrinally, I'm talking about just in, more secularly, there are things that need to be let go. We cannot let the past paralyze us and not to take steps forward in life. But the question is there a time when we should sweat the small stuff? In other words, when is a seemingly small matter actually a big deal according to God? Again, not according to us, according to God. Notice what Christ said about small stuff in Luke 16 and verse 10. He said, "He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much, and he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much." And so it appears from what Christ said here that there is a time when we should sweat the small stuff. Because even though it might seem like a small matter to us, it matters to God. To God when he was evaluating the quality of our character. Matthew 23. And so this sermon today, it was inspired by a similar message that was given by Larry Blake more than a decade ago. I'm not exactly sure how long ago. I think it was probably 13, 14 years ago. Now, Larry, he's since died, and he was a good man, a kind and decent man, a deep thinker. He even helped us with at least a few of our publications, going through and adding some of his thoughts and doing some editing. Particularly the Matthew 18 book that is, from what I remember, Art, I think it was Matthew 18 that Larry worked on with us. In any case, like all of us, Larry, he wasn't flawless. Nobody is. But Larry understood that small stuff matters. So don't sweat the small stuff. It's an expression signaling a need to take a step back, look at the big picture, and because many times people tend to be overly concerned about stuff that we should let go and waste a lot of time and energy worrying about things that are not that important. Perhaps there are matters that are no longer consequential, or we just have a hard time letting them go, and it eats away at us. We carry stuff around. I've had a tendency to do that in my life. But that shouldn't cause us to therefore disregard small details that still have value. Among the wider Church of God, our little group is considered very conservative, and that has been attractive to some. And I think most people in the Church of God would say, oh yeah, conservative. I like conservative, because we like to think we're all conservative when it comes to doctrine, when actually many times we might be quite liberal when it comes to certain commandments. But compared, of course, to, professing Christianity, those that keep Sunday was what I'm talking about, Sunday keepers, and those that keep those secular holidays, the Church of God in general appears very conservative when it comes to genuine doctrine. However, like Paul said, comparing yourselves among yourselves is not a good thing. The comparison we should be making is always with what the Scriptures say. Christ is the standard, not any other organization. Of course, many will view Jesus differently. They have different ideas of what Jesus was like, and we see in the world the majority of people that consider themselves to be Christian, they like the trim, effeminate, kind of long-haired looking Jesus who was just kind to everybody, no matter what they did, no matter who they were. But the version of Jesus that they are picturing is not the real Jesus. It's not what he was really like. He was a real man, a man's man, a rugged man. And he was very conservative when it came to doctrine. Now, simply because he was willing to converse with, tax collectors or harlots or, people that were blatant sinners, it doesn't mean that Jesus went around accepting all their behavior and said, that's okay. I love you anyway. No. He even compared himself to a physician that was called and came to help people that were sick. And these people were sick. They needed his help. Jesus did not go around preaching smooth things. He didn't go around trying to scratch or satisfy itching ears. Now, within this organization of the Church of God, we have had mostly, over the years, we mostly have had sermons that are corrective sermons. And it's because we recognize that, even though we are a genuine branch of the Church of God that dates all the way back to the time of Christ, it doesn't mean that we're all perfect. It doesn't mean that we all have the exact true and right doctrine, and we're all practicing it in the right way. We see problems in the Church of God, and we have not been afraid to address those problems. And perhaps that's one of the reasons we've stayed very small. I think that's probably the main reason we've stayed really very small. And because of this, we have been called by many Pharisaical, we have been called strict, or even one minister in a sermon referred to us as being curmudgeons. Now, accusers, they might refer to some of Christ's rebuke of Jews here, and some of the Jews anyway, in Matthew 23. And let's see, I didn't go back far enough. Matthew 23 and verse 23, where he said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, even very small herbs, they tithed on these things, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. And these you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Blind guides who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel." So what many who like to call others Pharisaical overlook when they consider some of the examples here that Christ gave is the fact that Christ never rebuked any of these people for being too conservative at keeping the law. Not once. What he did is he rebuked them for saying, well, you're going to do this part, but you're not going to do that part. And so he was saying you need to do both, not one or the other. In fact, we don't have a single word from God saying, oh, don't worry about some of these minute details of keeping the law. Just focus on the big stuff. What we do have is Christ saying, not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law until all is fulfilled. And the fulfillment he's talking about is when all is said and done, the new heavens and new earth, because at that point, everybody will be right in line with keeping every aspect of the law. And so in that respect, we see small stuff matters. It does matters. We see God scolding people for not keeping, I should say, even little parts of the law. So the adage, there is another adage that, and I'm sure you've heard this one, the devil is in the details. There are a few ways you can apply that adage, but what it means is that we need to read the fine print as to not get caught in a trap in some situations. But it can also mean this, leaving out the small details of the law, thinking that's not important. Well, that is something the devil would like for us to do, because those things add up. Small things matter. It can make a big difference. Let's continue in his rebuke here in verse 25. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of extortion and self-indulgence." Blind Pharisee, first cleanse the inside of the cup and dish, that the outside of them may be clean also. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. Even so, you also outwardly appear righteous to men, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. That's pretty harsh. Now, we've had sermons in this regard about being a genuine Christian from the inside out and from the outside in. And the reason is because many people, it's in our human nature, I think, they like to think that we'll just focus on those things that are more visible or those things that are weightier, and the big stuff is enough. That'll be enough for us to have favor in God's eyes. Well, maybe you might have a level of favor, but how much favor? Is it enough favor? That's the question. And so Christ, he never said to focus on justice and mercy and go ahead and neglect tithing on mint and anise and cumin. He said that they focused on these small matters, straining a gnat out of your soup, but you're going to swallow a camel and think that it's okay. So what he was talking about is they should have been doing both. And the example for us is the same, that we should be doing both, not one or the other. Let's go back a few pages to Matthew 19. So we know that some sins are worse than others. That should be clear to some people in the Church of God do not believe that. There are some people that believe that all sins are of the same value, which I don't believe. All sin is sin, of course, and Christ had to die for every sin, no matter how small we might think it is, but they're not all of the same degree. Murder is worse than lying, and adultery is worse than coveting. And we know that they aren't equal as far as degree, because God had harsher consequences for one as opposed to another. And so, because of this, many people do recognize this, but they might go on to think, well, the more severe sins, those are the ones that are more important. And so we can focus on those. And the lesser sins, well, they don't deserve much of my attention. I'll just kind of keep those in the back of my head. Maybe one day I'll get around to it. The human tendency is to care more about weightier matters and neglect lighter ones. But of course, that doesn't make it right. Human nature is flawed. It is something that we work to overcome. As it says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but the ways thereof are the ways of death. And so God says that his thought, we even sang that in one of the hymns today, his thoughts are not our thoughts, and this applies in multiple ways. Less attention by us to certain things can lead us to neglect those things, the small stuff. And these small sins, they're going to add up. They're going to make a big difference when it comes to qualification, when it comes to judgment. And this was exampled when a wealthy, righteous, by the way, a righteous young man came to Christ to ask him a very important question. You've heard this example read probably dozens, if not more times. And so this young man, that came to Christ, this young man, he believed that Christ was a prophet, and he likely even believed that Christ was, in fact, the Messiah. In Matthew 19, in verse 16, now behold, one came and said to him, Good teacher, what good thing shall I do that I may have eternal life? So clearly this man knew that something was lacking in his life. He didn't think that everything he was doing was just fine the way it was, or he wouldn't have come to him and asked Christ this question. He would have said, I'm okay, I'm good to go, just waiting for my crown. There must be something more, he thought. But he either didn't know exactly what else he could do, or it is, of course, possible that he was in denial of what he needed to do, and he wanted to go and see, should I sweat some of this small stuff or not? And so in verse 17, Christ said to him, Why do you call me good? No one is good but one, that is God. But if you want to enter into life, keep the commandments. He said to him, Well, which ones? Which ones should I keep? And the reason this young man questioned it is because of a lot of the extra-biblical laws, the rules, the regulations that were put on the people by the Pharisees, by the leadership at that time. And so Christ, he said, You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, honor your father and your mother, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Well, some like to think that, and we talked about this when I gave that series on defending the Sabbath, some like to think that because Christ named some of the commandments here, but not all of them, that these are the important ones. And the rest of them we can, are not that important. We don't really have to consider those ones. But that's not the case. You see, Christ was basically saying, here's some examples. Keep the commandments, all of them. You know which ones I'm talking about. I'm talking about the 10 Commandments. And so I don't believe at all that Christ deemed one of them more valuable than the other, saying, well, as long as you don't lie, as long as you don't steal or murder, that's good enough. He was asking the young man to consider the big picture of his life. Because a person's life has many details. Our lives have many details, both large and small. So the young man, in response to this, in verse 20, the young man said to him, "All these things I have kept from my youth. What do I still lack?" So we see this man, he was a commandment keeper. He kept the holy days. He did not eat unclean meats. He tithed on his increase, as far as we know anyway. And yet this man knew something was still missing. I've been doing these things, but I can tell there's something still missing. And he was willing to admit it. Good for him. Now, for most, of course, the pride of life gets the best of us, unlike this man. And the pride of life prevents us from agreeing that we lack in one way or another. We don't want to admit it. And we like to think that we're righteous the way we are. Not that we think we're flawless, but we like to think that we're good. Every man is right in his own eyes. That applies to just about everybody. But like this young man, we need to be willing to accept correction when it does come. Because it does come to us. And I'm not just talking about in services here. Correction comes to us in our life. If we really want to obey God and follow him and learn obedience, as the scriptures say we should, that's going to come to us at many times in our life. All throughout the week, things are going to be shown to us. Maybe not every day or every week, but things will be shown to us. If we're asking God, please show me what you want me to do. This is the contrite spirit that God is looking for. So while this man was a commandment keeper, well, whether it be his age, it says that he was a young man, or perhaps because of age, a lack of knowledge, or maybe he had, again, due to his age, a limited experience in many things, or maybe he was just simply in denial. We don't know exactly which one or a combination that it may have been, but it appears that he did not want to recognize that his lifestyle was a problem for him. This man's possessions became a stumbling block because the wealth caused him to compromise moral standards, God's standards. And so Jesus said to him, after saying, I've kept all these things, but I know I still lack. Where do I still lack? Jesus said to him in verse 21, "If you want to be perfect, go, sell what you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come, follow me." But when the young man heard that saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. Now this has led some to think that it's better to be poor than it is to be well off. Now that might be true for some if wealth is an obstacle, but it's not something across the board. We know that there have been wealthy people that are poor in spirit, that are humble and follow God in every way that they should, to the best of their ability. And that's what Christ was getting at here, is there are many ways, we know there are many ways to break each of the 10 commandments. And so the value of possessions was apparently a problem for this young man. And I wonder actually, upon reflecting on Christ's response here, I wonder if Christ's choice of picking those certain commandments to name to this young man, if it could be that because of the wealth that this individual had, he was actually breaking some of the principles of those commandments, not really looking at the depth of the commandments. As we've talked about many times, the 10 Commandments are like an umbrella, and there are many other laws that fall under the 10 Commandments. And so the point is, when it might seem like a small thing to us, it might be a big deal. If it opposes a principle, if it opposes a standard or law of God, it's not a small matter. It might seem like a small thing. Maybe we think we have bigger fish to fry. But God's looking at the big picture of our lives. He's looking at the whole, it's a package deal. People are a package deal. And you can't pick and choose the best parts of a person and say, that's the person I like. And then say, well, I'm not going to look at that. we have to consider, that we all have flaws, and those are things that we need to work on. So how conservative are we really when it comes to God's mandates? I'm not going to go through them today, but I'm asking us to consider, could it be that we are trying to be faithful in what is much, but we're disregarding being faithful in what is least? Because as Christ said, being faithful in the least shows how we are in general. Revelation 14, we'll look at a few examples there. Not just 14. I'm going to read just a couple of scriptures in a few chapters of Revelation. So the young man, he was wealthy, and he knew actually that the answer to his question was correct. We don't see him denying it. Of course, he may have walked away and denied it later, saying, he wasn't, he doesn't know me that well. I think he went away, though, knowing what he had to do. And that's why he was sorrowful. Jesus was telling this man, and in turn he was showing us, and has shown all of God's people down through the ages, that more is involved than just focusing on the letter of the law. It says that he came to make the law honorable, which basically means he came to show us the intent of the law, the spiritual application of the law in a variety of ways. Notice a description of those who will be chosen for the first resurrection in Revelation 14 and verse 12. It says, "Here is the patience of the saints." And it means perseverance. Here is the perseverance of the saints. Here are those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. Not faith in Jesus, believing in Jesus, but the faith of Jesus, the kind of faith Jesus had. In another scripture, if you go back to the last chapter of Revelation, Revelation 22 and verse 14, now this, of course, is describing some things after the final judgment. The new heavens, the new earth are in existence. But still, the same standards will apply to those people who will be given their opportunity for salvation during the millennium. And it says in Revelation 22 and verse 14, "Blessed are those who do his commandments, that they may have the right to the tree of life and may enter through the gates into the cities." See, this is something that you need to earn a right to, and we earn that right by qualifying for the kingdom by keeping his commandments. So which commandments is God talking about? Which ones? Is it just the ones Christ mentioned to the young wealthy man? Is it, just weightier interpretations of the 10 commandments? Are there others included? Well, there are others included. Many others. Actually, there are hundreds of mandates found in the Torah. And while some are of more importance than others, it doesn't mean that the other ones do not matter. They all matter. God never said that this one matters and the other one doesn't matter as much. Consider the example of the marriage of the Lamb and his wife in Revelation 19, if you go back a few pages. It says that the wife has prepared herself for the honor, for the prestige of being able to be a part of that event. And in Revelation 19 and verse 7, these angels cry out, "Let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his wife has made herself ready. And to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints." So it says that the wife has made herself ready. In what way has she made herself ready? How'd she prepare? Is she just, getting all dressed up, washing her hair, putting on some sparkly shoes? No, her attire is something that's going to be provided at that time. But the clothes, they represent something. They represent, it says, the righteous acts of the saints. And that's the type of preparation that it is being spoken of, where it says she has made herself ready. And so in order to make herself ready for that event, the preparation began a long time ago when these individuals were human beings. Now, the preparation is not by her alone. Of course, she has an intimate and vital part to play, but God has an intimate role to play in this preparation as well. But, you know, he does work with people, whether it be protection or allowing them to consider allowing them to experience certain trials, tests, if you will, to refine character. But Christ's righteousness, like so many people think, his righteousness is not infused into people. It is not instilled within us. We have to earn the kind of character that God hopes to see in us. And that is something that's developed. It's something that's developed by what we do, the choices we make, the experiences we have. And this is the maturation process. We talked about that just a few days ago in the Romans 4 Bible study. And so the fine linen that his wife is going to wear, that it says is clean and bright, it doesn't represent the righteousness of Christ, although it's similar to his righteousness, right? It's of the same value, the same degree, but it's the righteous acts of the saints that's being portrayed here. And that righteousness includes both big and small stuff. Let's go back to 2 Samuel, all the way back to the Old Covenant, 2 Samuel. The Old Covenant with an enduring value. So we started talking about the wedding supper of the marriage, that is, of Christ and his wife. Now, in a grand wedding, consider a grand wedding of royalty, if you will. Think about the wedding that just took place in, well, when was that? A couple years back in England. Maybe more than a few years. I can't remember. In any case. A grand wedding with royalty involved, held in a large, perhaps decadent church hall with thousands of attendees, and the bride, she comes out dressed in this beautiful gown that's bright and clean. What if it was noticed that there was a spot on her dress? Would we overlook it? Would people overlook it? Well, perhaps people would. Most people, I think, would overlook it. Some would perhaps be a little overly concerned and focus on it. You know how the media is. But what if there were 2 spots? What if there were 3 or 5? What if there was a lot of spots, like such when you go over a mud puddle, it goes splashing everywhere, and that's all over her gown, or maybe, you know, there's some grease marks from the wheel on the carriage there on her outfit. Would that be overlooked? I think not. There would be a need to change. We need to fix this. And so the point is, soiled linen is not befitting of a righteous bride. Not according to God's standards. And so we saw in Revelation, her attire is described as being bright and fine and clean. And that is the only thing that God will accept for the grandest of weddings that will ever be. And while nobody that will be chosen for that honor, I don't believe that anybody that is going to be chosen for that honor will be selected entirely free of sin in their human life. The purpose of our calling is to prepare for that wedding, to get ready for it by seeking to have the kind of character that will qualify us to be the bride. And that quality of character is shown by how we handle not just big things, big stuff, but also small and medium matters. Because like I said before, that is what forms the whole picture of what we are, of who we are. Small, medium, and big stuff. And so what are some of the spots that we might have to consider, that we might think, well, that's small. That's a small thing. You might want a list, and I'm not going to give you one. I really can't. I cannot provide a list for people of the small versus the large stuff. I can give an opinion if we have a conversation of what might be of lesser, importance. But my point is, it's all important. We don't start to pick and choose. That's the point today. The scriptures, the scriptures don't say that, there are certain laws and behaviors that you should keep, but the other ones, they're not, as worth focusing on. And so I couldn't say such a thing either. They certainly say that some cannot be glossed over, that they can't be, and just focus on others. They simply tell us, here's what's important to God. And they give us a list of those things that God cares about. And so we see that God cares about everything. Christ did say that, and this is in Matthew 5 and verse 19, you don't have to turn there, but I'm just going to read it. He said, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. And I think that it's not saying, well, don't worry, he's still going to be in the kingdom of heaven. He's just going to be the least. He's going to be a janitor in the kingdom. I think he's saying, no, those people in the kingdom that are going to be in the kingdom are saying, that's not worth being a part of the kingdom, if that's what people are going to do, to teach people that, there are some of these commandments that you can break, and it's okay. So it seems pretty clear to me that God's concerned about everything, not just weightier matters. And there's an example of this found in 2 Samuel chapter 6, and this is regarding a handling of the Ark of the Covenant. Now, when God told Israel to make the Ark, the commandments were going to be in there, Aaron's rod was going to be in there, an omer of manna was going to be put into this Ark, and it was going to be representative of his throne, and he would dwell with the people, not literally dwell. At times he would come down, but he wouldn't literally be inside of that little box all the time, but it represented God being among the people. And he told them when they made the ark that they were to have 4 rings that were fastened to the corners of the ark, and that there would be poles of acacia wood covered with gold, and they would go through the rings. And it was for the carrying of the ark. And the reason is because, as he said in Numbers 4:15, that the sons of Kohath shall carry the furniture, but they shall not touch any holy thing. So nobody was to touch the ark. Now, clearly that does not mean that people were not allowed to touch it when they put the stuff in. Some way had to be to open it when it was made, to be able to put the commandments and Aaron's rod that budded and the manna inside. But after this, nobody was supposed to touch the ark. After the ark was stolen by the Philistines, there was a curse put on those people because they took the ark and they sent it back to Israel, and it was received by Israel, and it was placed into the home of Abinadab, where it stayed for quite some time. And after many years, David became king, and he wanted to bring the ark back to the capital of Israel. And in 2 Samuel 6 and verse 1, after David gathered, David gathered all the choice men of Israel, 30,000, and David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, whose name is called by the name of the Lord, of hosts, who dwells between the cherubim. So they set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, drove the new cart. And they brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, accompanying the ark of God. And Ahio went before the ark. And then David and all the house of Israel played music before the Eternal. It was a glorious celebration. This was great. God's ark is being restored, and this represents God's way being restored throughout the land of Israel. So they played music before the Eternal and all kinds of instruments of fir wood, on harps and stringed instruments, on tambourines and sistrums, and on cymbals. And when they came to Nachon's threshing floor, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Eternal was aroused against Uzzah, and God struck him there for his error, and he died there by the ark of God. Now, many people out in the professing Christian community would say, see, there's that mean old God of the Old Testament. Oh, what a mean, no mercy for Uzzah, come on. But Christ is that God. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And this may seem like a small thing to some, and probably seemed like a small thing to Uzzah, maybe even to David, as we see it when we read through some of the other verses. At least initially it seemed like a small thing to David, because it says that he was upset about that. David became angry because of the Lord's outbreak against Uzzah. But this was not a small thing. God said, here's how you handle the ark. He didn't give any ifs or buts. If something starts to move a little bit, you can go ahead and touch it to keep it steady. He didn't say that. And this is an example that we can't be presumptuous and say like, well, I'm going to apply God's law in the way that I think is best. No, we apply it in the way that he says. If God says don't touch it, it means don't touch it. So the example was for all to see at that time, but also for us today. Because at that time, they were saying, we're going to restore God's way of life. We're bringing the ark back. God's way is going to be restored throughout the land of Israel. Well, God is saying, I think here, saying, look, if you're going to do this, I'm with you. But don't do it the way you think you should. Do it the way I tell you to do it. Handle the things of God the way I tell you to handle the things of God, not how you think it should be handled. Let's go to Ephesians 4. Ephesians 4. So when it comes to the things of God, it's important to consider that we might think some of it is small stuff. But none of it is really small. Is some more important? Are there things that are higher on the list? Yes. I would agree to that, and we would all agree to that. But does that mean those things lower on the list are not important? Don't think about that. Just go from, like I said, I forget the number. I had the number at one time, but hundreds. There are actually hundreds of mandates in the Torah about the way we should be morally. So should we just keep the first 100 and the rest don't worry about? Maybe let's be conservative. Hey, we're conservative. We'll keep the first 200. And we'll just not worry about the rest. No, we're supposed to think about all of them. Of course, some of those things do not apply to us because we're not a part of the Levitical priesthood that handled the sacrifices and offerings. So some of those mandates in the Torah include those types of activities. So simply because there are many things for us to consider, don't be overwhelmed by this. I know some people think like, oh man, well, like the letter I had gotten from that gentleman, where does it end? Where do I stop? You're putting so many restrictions on my life. It's too bad people look at it that way. They look at what we can't experience or do in life instead of considering all of the things that we can do. I mean, God's law is called a law of liberty. It's liberating. It's not restricting our behavior to what can be experienced in this life. That's restrictive. But God's law liberates us so that we have many other things that we will be able to experience in another life, much more than this life. So there is a time to sweat the small stuff when it comes to the details that make a big picture of our life. Now, the righteous in the scriptures are considered to be walking with God. We read about Enoch, he walked with God, and Noah walked with God, and there were others. And what this means is God is, navigating our life. He isn't literally walking side by side with us, but it's figurative, and he's showing us the way. It's a way of life that James said is to keep oneself unspotted from the world. And think about the fine, bright, and clean linen, unspotted from the world. And so As much as most people do not want to say it, we shouldn't be afraid to say, guess what? You earn that right. You earn the right to have the fine linen. Yes, although it's a gift, not everybody gets it. We have to qualify for it. We have to qualify. As it says, we need to have a right. It says you have the right to partake from the tree of life. Ephesians 4 in verse 11 says, and he himself gave some, and speaking of Christ and establishing the government of the New Testament church there and here. It says he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure and stature of the fullness of Christ. It's talking about maturity. It's not talking about being flawless. Our idea of perfection in our age is more digital, where we think, if one of the little part of the syntax is off, it's not perfect. Well, none of us are going to be exactly perfect, but we can be mature, and that's what God is getting at. That's what it means. It means being spiritually mature, as was the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, that we should no longer be children, tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine by the trickery of men and the cunning craftiness of deceitful plotting, but speaking the truth in love may grow up in all things into him who is the head, Christ. Notice the terms that are being used here. No longer be children. It's time to grow up. It's time to become mature. As it says, grow up in all things into him who is the head. So yes, figuratively, we are considered begotten children of God. And compared to God, yes, our knowledge is pretty small. But we can be mature. We can be righteous. There are people in the scriptures and people today that we could consider to be righteous individuals because they are doing all that they can to follow God as perfectly as they know how. Doesn't mean that they are flawless, but they are on the way to perfection. So this perfection that God and Jesus spoke about, it doesn't mean that we are ever going to be entirely bright and white and clean today. But it's something we can do to become unspotted from the world. And there's an example found in the maturity of a child when we have, those of us who have had children who can fully relate to this, but even if you do not have children, you are all children at one time, physically speaking, and you can all relate to this, that a child, they are taught by their parents, and they emulate what their parents teach and what they do. And as a child grows, they gain knowledge and experience, and when they apply that knowledge, it turns to wisdom. And even Christ, he learned. Yeah, he learned from a child. He didn't come out of the womb fully knowing everything. It says in Luke 2 and verse 40 that the child grew and became strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. So God didn't just infuse righteousness into Christ as a child. He became that way. And Jesus, it says in verse 52 of the same chapter, Luke 2, that Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. And so we go through the same process. That's the point. The same process of becoming strong in spirit, being filled with wisdom, increasing in the knowledge of God, the grace of God, which means God influencing our heart and mind and how that's reflected in our life. We learn obedience. So we find that when it comes to the things of God, even the small stuff is important. And the saying, I don't want you to get the wrong idea. The saying, don't sweat the small stuff, It's not wrong in and of itself, but just know that it's contextual. And it applies mostly to stuff that's secular, is what it applies to. But even then, even if it's just applied in a secular way, it can have its drawbacks. Consider something that was written by Dr. Romanoff, who wrote about some of the possible drawbacks of not sweating the small stuff. Sometimes people commit themselves too far in the opposite direction by adapting an extremely easygoing philosophy to the way they live their lives. This strategy can appear to be helpful on the surface. However, the person may suppress their natural frustrations, needs, and preferences in the moment in order to appear flexible and carefree. They may not set or enforce personal boundaries, which can be detrimental to them. In addition, when you look closely at something minor that's stressing you out, you may realize that that's not really what's bothering you. Sometimes the minor things that trigger us are representative of bigger insecurities, issues, or wounds. When we find ourselves considerably overreacting to a situation, it's rarely about the small inconvenience. It's actually about a deeper issue or wound that is rubbing up against us. Upon closer examination, we may find that our reactions are caused by issues related to feeling disrespected or unappreciated, scared or insecure, like we're losing control. So those are some of the major issues that have to be dealt with that may seem small, but it's actually a big deal. When it comes to the things of God, everything counts, and we can compare it. I've heard it compared in the sermon more than once, but I think it's a great comparison, comparing it to a term paper that most of us have had to write a term paper at some time to be turned in and graded on. And when we turn that paper in, what counts? Everything. Everything in it counts. The introduction, the grammar, the punctuation, the clarity, the proper citing, the conclusion. Every sentence counts in a term paper. Every period and comma, just as every jot and tittle of the law. A final scripture, Matthew 24, to conclude. In the 1996 Summer Olympics in Atlanta, Georgia, the U.S. women's softball team were playing against Australia, and they lost only one game, but the Australian game was the one that they lost, and it was the game that they should have won. In the fifth inning, with the score tied, a U.S. player by the name of Danny Tyler, she hit a home run over the fence, and she trotted around the bases and was happy, and she had victory in her stride. And when she reached home plate, with all the excitement of her teammates congratulating her and giving her high fives, she failed to touch the plate. When she reached the dugout, the opposing team touched home plate, and the umpire at first base agreed that she stepped right over the plate, and she had to return to third base, where she was stranded, and she never made it home. The score was 0-0 in the ninth inning, and that inning ended, and the U.S. did score a run in the 10th inning, but also in that same 10th inning, which would be the bottom of the inning, one strike away from defeat, an Australian player had hit a 2-run homer, and that won the game for Australia. Now, of course, the loss was a blow to the American team, but even more so for Tyler. The moral of the story is we might start out on the good foot in obeying God, but don't think that since we have, that the game's in the bag. You know, that's an attitude that I commonly see in the wider Church of God. Not everybody, but it's common to see that there's this attitude that Christians feel like we've done well. We're the good guys. We're on the winning team. Christ knocked it out of the ballpark for us. All we have to do is wait it out. The rest is going to take care of itself. My crown's waiting for me. It's going to be great. Not so. How we play the game matters. How we finish is crucial. Small stuff matters, and being faithful in the least means much. And so we have to touch every base. Consider the next time we think that a mandate, a precept, a letter of the commandment, that we think it's not a big deal. And instead, ask if now is the time where we should sweat the small stuff. Matthew 24, verse 42. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. And he's talking about watching ourselves, watching our behavior. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour that you do not expect. Who then is that faithful and wise servant whom his master made ruler over his house to give them food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing.